So we want to add validation. And actually, I want to use my posts example here. Now, how can you add validation in MongoDB? A very easy way of adding it is when you add a collection for the first time. So when you create a collection and you learned that the collection is created automatically when you start inserting data into it. So here, let's say I want to drop my posts collection. So now if I try to find one post, that will not work. Now let's create the collection differently, not implicitly once we add something, but explicitly. For that, we got the create collection command. We didn't use it thus far because often that lazy creation, where it only gets created if it's needed, is okay. But if you want to configure your collection a special way, well, then you can use that create collection command. There, you first of all, as a first argument to the create collection method, define the name of the collection. In our case, it would be posts. So previously, you just accessed it and started working with it. Now you create it, and therefore you have to define the name here. The second argument is a document where you can configure that collection. And one important piece of configuration here is the validator. The validator key takes another sub-document where you can now define a schema against which incoming data with inserts or updates has to validate. You do this by adding a JSON schema key, $JSON schema key here, JSON schema, and then again another nested document. And this now holds the schema. So here we're just saying, hey, our validator is the JSON schema. Historically, there were other validators, but it is strongly recommended to go with JSON schema now. And then you define the schema here in this nested document. Now there, you can define a schema for every document which is added to the collection. For example, we can set the BSON type here to object. So everything that gets added to the collection should be a valid document or object. More interestingly, we can set a required key here, which is an array. And here we can define names of fields in the document, which will be part of that post collection, that are absolutely required. And if we try to add data that does not have these fields, we'll get an error or warning, depending on our settings. So here, we simply pass the names of the fields. Like in our case, for the post here, we could say a title is required and a text is required. Maybe tags are not required. The creator is required though, so creator, and the comments, let's say, are also required. So now these 4 fields are required on every document that gets added to the posts collection. Now we can even dive a bit deeper and start working on our properties. Now, since this gets a bit hard to read, let me actually take that entire command here and move into a text editor where this is easier to read. I created a validation.js file. It should be a JS file if you're using a tool like Visual Studio Code to get nice syntax completion. The name does not matter at all. And I'll paste in my command and use the auto-formatting capabilities of that IDE, which you can find by inspecting the key bindings there. Under Preferences, Keyboard Shortcuts, and then Format Document is what you want to look for. This shortcut here, I use that to format this in a nicer way. So this is what we wrote thus far, a validator with a schema for the overall document. And now we can add a properties key, which is another nested document, where we can define for every property of every document that gets added to the posts collection, how it should look like. For example, the title field. Keep in mind, title is required here. By the way, that is incorrect. Every element here should be a separate string, not one big string. So like this, it should look like this, 4 strings. So title is required, and now we can define it in even more detail. We can not just say it's required, which is already done here. We can say the BSON type here should be string. And that comes back to the data types you learned before, and also consult that lecture I added earlier where you see a list of all the data types, because you'll need to type as it's noted in the MongoDB documentation here. So only strings are accepted as titles. You can also add a description here, so must be a string and is required could be added here. And we can do that for all our properties now. So for the text too, what would that be? Well, it would also be a string. And we can also pass a description here, which is just the same description as up there. The creator, on the other hand, that would be a BSON type of object ID. Here the MongoDB equivalent is object ID written like this as a string. So here we can also add this must be an object ID and is required. We also have our comments here, and the comment has a BSON type of array because in our post we got multiple comments. So we can also add a description must be an array. And of course, our comment, since we have multiple items in there, you can add an items key here, which describes how the items should look like in that array. There you can set the BSON type to object, because every item will have to be a document. It's not allowed to be a string, it will have to be a document. Well, and in our comments, as we added them before, we had a text and an author. So we'll again add a properties key here, and now basically say, well, every item in the array has a text field, which in turn is of type or BSON type text, where we can have a description must be a string and is required. And for it to be required on the items in the array, we should add the required key and say that text is required and that author is required. And then down there in the properties setup, we can also add, or we should add the author and say, well, the author, here the BSON type is object ID, and we also have a description must be an object ID and is required. Now you can find this document attached to this video in case this was too fast. In the end, I'm defining a simple schema on how you can validate incoming data for our posts collection. And I'm doing this when we create the collection. So we can copy that entire command now and move back to the shell. And of course, at the end of this module, you'll find a link to the detailed official docs with all validation options. So I can enter this command here, and I got an error here. Object ID is not understood, and indeed that is correct. It should be object ID with a capital I. In the file which you download, this will already be fixed. I fix it here manually, and I also had a problem here. The BSON type of text is not text, but string. I did that correctly up here. Simply reuse text here. That should be string. Again, in the document you download, this will be fixed. With that added, let's now add it here. We get OK. And now, if I look at the posts, there's nothing in there, of course, still. But now let's insert a document. And for that, I'll repeat my previous insertion with title, my first post, text, and so on. If I hit enter, this succeeds. So now if I find one post, this is the post I added. Now let me try inserting something where my author is not an object ID, let's say, but a random number, because maybe I have authors stored which I want to match by that number which fits another field. Now I get an error. I get an error in the end which says document failed validation. And that is a pretty clear error, right? We failed validation. And if I now look into my posts with find to see all posts in there, we actually see indeed the post was not added there because we just get an error telling us that we failed.